Just another temp nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling told the nursing station at 7:51 a.m., before Elena Martinez had even clocked in. He didn't see the scarred knuckles on her hands, pale crescents from field-stripping weapons in dust storms that no longer had names. He didn't see the faded unit patch sewn into the jacket lining hanging in her locker, SEAL team insignia from operations that officially never happened. What he saw was a woman with trembling hands filling out new hire paperwork, someone who would quit within a week, someone manageable. They were wrong. And it would cost him everything. The Black Hawks were already fueling up 3 states away, and by the end of this shift, they would be landing on Sacred Heart's helipad with a commander who had been searching for her for 18 months. Elena Martinez moves through the fluorescent-lit corridors of Sacred Heart in Raleigh with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned to vanish in plain sight. Her shoes are silent on polished linoleum. The smell of antiseptic hits her first, that particular hospital smell that hasn't changed in 20 years. Underneath the bleach and floor wax is something else. Underneath is the smell of endings. Her badge reads Elena M.R.N., long-term care in clinical sans serif. Not her real name. Not her real background. Just a woman who appeared in Raleigh 3 years ago with references from a Tennessee clinic and a social security number that would hold up to a cursory check but nothing deeper. That was the point. The long-term care wing at Sacred Heart occupies the 4th floor west, where the money flows quieter and the expectations are managed carefully. There are 17 private rooms, each one occupied by someone whose family had decided, or been persuaded, that continued medical intervention was the most loving choice. Machines breathe for them. Tubes feed them. Medications keep their hearts pumping with the mechanical reliability of things that should have stopped long ago. The ventilators sound like exhausted sighs. The monitors beep in asynchronous rhythms, a chorus of failing bodies conducted by hospital policy and insurance reimbursement codes. Bed 7 sits at the end of the south corridor. Elena stops in the doorway before she's supposed to, before her shift officially begins. The chart was already open in her mind from 3 years of observation, 3 years of watching from a distance. Colonel James Reeves, Green Beret, multiple deployments to Baghdad, catastrophic injuries sustained during a convoy ambush outside the Green Zone 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. The injuries themselves were listed in clinical language that obscured the actual violence: traumatic brain injury with diffuse axonal damage, crush injuries to bilateral lower extremities, penetrating thoracic trauma with pulmonary contusion. What the chart didn't say was that a Humvee had flipped into a burning ditch, and the only reason James Reeves had survived the first 72 hours was because a Navy SEAL medic had pulled him out and kept him alive in a field hospital using field equipment and blood and refusal to accept the alternative. James Reeves lies motionless in bed 7. His body has wasted down to angles and shadows over 2 years of inactivity. His eyes are closed, they're almost always closed. The ventilator tubing runs from his mouth, held in place with tape that has been changed 10,000 times. His chest rises and falls with mechanical precision. And runs into his left arm. A feeding tube passes through his nose. A catheter drains into a bag hung on the side rail. This is what continued medical intervention looks like when there is no improvement, when there has been no change, when the family has accepted that there will be no change. His sister visits once a month. She holds his hand and tells him about her daughter's soccer season. She cries in the parking lot for 20 minutes before driving back to Charlotte. That is the whole of his world now. Machines and visiting hours and a team of nurses who care for his body but have been trained by policy and by Dr. Sterling's particular philosophy to expect nothing from it. Elena approaches the bed. Her hand reaches out, not to check his vitals, not to adjust a line, just to touch the cold metal rail. She steadies herself. Her hand is completely steady when it contacts the steel. No tremor. No hesitation. She stands there for 3 seconds that feel like much longer, then she turns away and walks back down the corridor toward the nursing station where she is supposed to be filling out paperwork. Dr. Sterling is already there. He watches her approach from behind his silver-rimmed glasses, his eyes moving from her feet to her face with the deliberate assessment of someone cataloging a new piece of furniture. He's 61 years old, with the careful grooming of a man who has built his life on institutional power, salt and pepper hair trimmed weekly, a Rolex Submariner on his left wrist, a tailored white coat that costs more than some nurses make in a month. The coat has his name embroidered in blue thread, Dr. James Sterling, MD, Unit Director. Behind him, the nursing station hums with the quiet desperation of people clocking in for another shift in a system they've learned not to question. Miss Martinez. Sterling's voice carries the measured patience of a man speaking to someone slightly less intelligent than himself. Welcome to the long-term care team at Sacred Heart. We have very specific protocols here. Very specific expectations about patient care and professional standards. I trust that won't be a problem. Elena's hands move through the paperwork in front of her with mechanical precision. She is acutely aware of Sterling's gaze. She is acutely aware of the other nurses at the station, for RNs and 2 CNAs who have learned to recognize his tone and are already moving slightly away, creating space. She signs her name, Elena M. Rodriguez. The middle initial conceals nothing. It simply exists. No problem at all, she says, her voice in the register that has sustained her for 3 years in Raleigh, deferential, careful, the voice of someone who has learned to take up minimal space. I'm here to do the job. Good. We've had some turnover lately. Some people find long-term care depressing. Some people get attached. Some people start thinking they can do things that haven't been approved by administration. He adjusts his glasses with one finger, a gesture that feels rehearsed. Sacred Heart has been very clear about our protocols. Patients here receive the standard of care, no experimental interventions, no heroic measures, no exceptions. Families understand this. The board understands this. Everyone understands this. You'll want to be clear on that moving forward. The other nurses don't look up from their computers. But Elena hears the message in the silence. This is the speech he gives to everyone who arrives with ideas about actually helping people. I understand, Elena says. Her hands have stopped trembling. They were never trembling, actually, but she had let them appear to tremble. That was a choice she had made 3 years ago when she arrived in Raleigh with a destroyed service record and a new social security number. Trembling hands meant someone frightened. Someone without confidence. Someone who would not question authority. Someone manageable. She learned to make her hands perform fear the way an actor performs any emotion. Right now, she is performing fear very well. Sterling nods, satisfied. He turns his attention to a file on his desk, dismissing her with the casual cruelty of a man who has spent 30 years in institutional medicine learning that the hierarchy is not a suggestion. Your primary assignment is Bed 7. Colonel Reeves. He's been with us since his initial placement 2 years ago. Stable on current protocols. No family involvement beyond the monthly sister visit. Minimal intervention required. Essentially custodial care at this point. You'll handle vital signs, hygiene, feeding tube management, catheter care. Standard long-term care protocols. If there are any changes in his condition, you report them to Dr. Hendricks on day shift or myself on administrative rounds. No independent assessments. No recommendations. Just observations and documentation. Clear. Clear, Elena says. Her voice is still performing fear. Her voice is still deferential. But underneath the performance, underneath the tremor and the careful politeness, something else is moving. Something that has been waiting for 2 years, for months and 16 days. She finishes the paperwork and stands. The routine of the shift begins then, the gathering of report materials, the handoff from night shift, the assignment of rooms. Elena receives the long-term care wing. 13 patients across 17 rooms. Colonel Reeves in Bed 7. A 78-year-old woman who suffered a massive stroke in Bed 3. A 54-year-old man with advanced Parkinson's in Bed 9. The usual roster of people whose bodies have decided to stop responding to the normal stimuli that keep humans alive, and whose families have paid for the machinery and the staff to maintain them in that suspension indefinitely. This is the business model of long-term care. Billable hours. Insurance reimbursement. Families who believe that the possibility of recovery, however infinitesimal, justifies the expense and the continuation. Elena walks toward the locker room where her jacket hangs on a hook marked with a small piece of tape that reads Elena Martinez. She reaches into the pocket and her fingers brush against a small object sewn into the inside lining of the jacket. It's the size of a postage stamp. It's the color of faded olive drab. It's the only thing she has left from her previous life, a unit patch from a team that officially never existed, from operations that have been erased from the historical record, from a person named something else who performed actions that have been classified and sealed and locked behind layers of military bureaucracy that will probably never be opened. She doesn't look at it. She just touches it for 3 seconds. Muscle memory. A greeting. A promise. Then she closes her jacket back into the locker and turns toward her shift. The smell of antiseptic follows her down the corridor. The sound of ventilators continues their mechanical breathing. The fluorescent lights hum overhead with a particular frequency of institutional lighting, constant, inescapable, the acoustic background to all American hospitals. Elena moves through it all with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned to be present while leaving no impression. She is the kind of nurse who won't be remembered in 3 weeks. She is the kind of person Dr. Sterling has already assessed and filed and determined to be manageable. He has built his entire reputation on identifying people like her, people without obvious power, people who won't question authority, people who can be moved through the institutional machinery without friction. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Sterling. The worst part was that he was wrong. Catastrophically, irrevocably wrong. Morning rounds at Sacred Heart's long-term care wing began like every other morning, fluorescent lights humming overhead, monitors beeping their mechanical rhythms, the antiseptic smell of industrial-strength bleach and hope fading in equal measure. Elena arrived at 6:53 a.m., 15 minutes before the official start, and found the nursing station already crowded. Dr. Sterling stood at the center like a conductor before an orchestra, chart in hand, his tailored suit somehow pristine at this hour. He glanced up as she approached, and something shifted in his expression, a predator recognizing fresh prey. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling announced, his voice projecting across the entire station so that every nurse, every aide, every respiratory tech could hear clearly. "I'm betting $50 our new nurse Martinez here doesn't make it a week." He paused for effect, letting the weight of the words settle. "Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the staff like a shock wave. Some uncomfortable. Some genuine. Elena felt every pair of eyes turn toward her. She took one measured breath, the kind she'd learned in a field hospital in Kandahar 20 years ago, when taking any breath at all felt like a luxury she hadn't earned. She said nothing. Her face remained unchanged, though internally she was already calculating. $50. A test. A line drawn in the sand that said she didn't belong here, that she was temporary, that this man held all the power and intended to use it to remind her of that fact every single day. Sterling turned back to his rounds as if she'd already ceased to exist. She followed the group, trailing slightly behind, and began her observations. Colonel Reeves' left pupil was more responsive than his right. His oxygen saturation had dipped to 94% during the night shift, documented right there on the chart, though Sterling's notes dismissed it as routine fluctuation. Elena had seen that kind of unequal pupil response before. In Baghdad. In the Humvee. In the moments before everything went wrong. She said nothing about it. Not yet. That afternoon, Elena was sitting in the cafeteria with a salad and coffee, trying to disappear into the corner booth where the kitchen sounds provided cover. Sterling appeared without warning, walking past her table with the casual precision of someone who had calculated exactly how much force would send her tray flying. His hip caught the edge. Salad scattered across the tile floor in an explosion of lettuce and vinaigrette. Coffee pooled like blood. Croutons skittered under adjacent tables. "Careful," Sterling said, his voice honey-smooth. "These floors get slippery." He didn't stop. Didn't offer to help. Didn't acknowledge the 3 other staff members who suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Elena knelt to clean it up, her movements deliberate and unhurried, refusing to scramble or rush or show any sign of distress. That was what he wanted: panic, tears, the satisfaction of watching her crumble. A single tear escaped despite her efforts, a physiological response to adrenaline and humiliation that no amount of training could entirely suppress. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with him as he watched from across the cafeteria, confirming what he already believed. He was winning. She was broken. This would be over within days. But that tear wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the trembling that comes from holding back exactly what you're capable of doing, from knowing that you could move from kneeling position to standing in 1.3 seconds and that your hands knew 17 different ways to end a person's career permanently. The tear was the physical manifestation of discipline. He simply didn't have the context to recognize it as such. By evening, Sterling had positioned himself in the hall outside Colonel Reeves' room, waiting for her rounds. Elena approached with the Colonel's evening chart, and Sterling stepped directly into her path. The chart, Colonel Reeves' thick medical file, was in his hands. Without a word, he threw it at her feet with the kind of contempt usually reserved for people he considered beneath acknowledgement. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping condescension like oil. "And when you're done playing nurse, maybe review what actual doctors have already tried. We don't need fresh ideas from community college graduates." 3 residents had witnessed it. 2 other nurses pretended they were looking at something very important on their phones. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed like an insect trapped in glass. Elena stood motionless for 3 seconds, long enough for Sterling to feel victorious, long enough to let him believe he'd won. Then she spoke. "I've picked up better men than you from worse places than this." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It had the quality of steel drawn across stone, a sound that made the hair on the back of Sterling's neck stand up, though he wouldn't have admitted it. It was a voice that had issued commands in combat zones, that had talked dying men through their final moments, that carried the weight of authority built on decades of decisions where mistakes measured in millimeters meant the difference between life and death. The room went dead silent. Sterling's jaw tightened. A muscle worked in his cheek. His hand clenched into a fist at his side, and for a moment, just a moment, Elena saw what he looked like when his control started to slip. Then he turned and walked away, his steps slightly faster than they had been, his shoulders rigid with anger that hadn't yet transformed into action. The other nurses wouldn't meet Elena's eyes as she bent to collect the scattered papers. They wouldn't make eye contact in the break room. By the time her shift ended, word had traveled through the nursing staff like a virus. The new hire had talked back to Sterling. That meant she was either the bravest person in the building or the dumbest. Either way, she'd made an enemy, and everyone knew what happened to people who crossed Dr. Sterling. He had friends on the board. He had the hospital's trust. He had institutional power that could erase a person's entire career with a single phone call. Elena drove home through rain that hammered against her windshield like applause, wondering if Sterling was already reaching for his phone, already composing the narrative that would unravel her carefully constructed life. The apartment was dark when she arrived, a small studio in a converted Victorian on the edge of downtown Raleigh. She locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on any lights, just watching rain streak down the window. Somewhere in this city, Sterling was probably making calls. Activating his network. Preparing whatever came next. She should have let him win. Should have picked up that chart without speaking, should have accepted the insult with the humility he expected from people he'd already decided were worthless. But that wasn't what 20 years of sealed service records and classified extractions had prepared her for. That wasn't what the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only physical proof of who she actually was, represented. That patch had been removed from the uniform of a woman who no longer officially existed, tucked away as a memorial to a life that was classified even from herself. She opened the lockbox under her bed. Inside was a social security card with her real name. A discharge document stamped classified at every margin. A photograph of a 6-year-old boy covered in dust and blood, taken in a market in Baghdad that no longer existed, a child she'd kept alive for 3 days while everything around them burned. Elena held the photograph in the darkness and made a decision she would spend the next 72 hours paying for. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew exactly what Dr. Sterling was about to do, and she had already accepted that the cost of telling the truth about Colonel Reeves would be everything she'd spent 2 decades protecting. Dr. Sterling's office smelled like mahogany and money, old money, the kind that came from 43 years of never being told no. He sat behind a desk the size of a surgical bed, phone already at his ear, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who'd learned long ago that threats sound better when delivered with a smile. "Gerald, it's Sterling." No greeting, no preamble. The man on the other end of the line was a board member, former fraternity brother, current cardiovascular surgeon with a parking spot that said it all. "I need to discuss a staffing concern. New hire on long-term care. Elena Martinez. I'm running background protocols as a matter of institutional security." He listened to the response, nodding as though Gerald could see him through the phone line. That was Sterling's gift, making people feel like they were part of the decision, even when he'd already decided for them. "The issue is employment history. Pre-2008 records are sparse. No verifiable references before her Tennessee clinic work. When I contacted Sacred Heart's HR about standard documentation, I got evasive responses." Sterling paused, letting that word hang. Evasive. As though Elena had something to hide, not as though she might have legitimate reasons a nurse would protect her privacy. "I'm concerned about a potential security liability. We handle sensitive patients. Wealthy families. I need to know who we're hiring." Another pause. Sterling was good at pauses. "I've already contacted the Tennessee clinic for verification. They're being remarkably uncooperative. Which raises questions. Yes, I thought you'd see it that way. I'm bringing in an outside investigator, someone discreet, someone from the firm that handles board security, to examine her employment records before her nursing licensure. Just due diligence." He hung up before Gerald could ask the one question that might slow him down. Momentum was Sterling's actual skill. Build it fast enough and people got swept along without thinking to examine the current. By 2:17 p.m., Sterling had made for more calls. 2 board members who owed him favors from the clinic's expansion vote. A contact at the state nursing board who could flag Elena's file for routine verification. And a private investigator named Dane Colbert who specialized in background checks that found exactly what the client wanted found. Her social security number, Sterling told Colbert over the phone, traces back to 2008. Before that, nothing. No tax records, no employment history, no college transcripts. She claims to have graduated with a nursing degree in 2006 from a program that burned down in 2007. Very convenient. Military discharge? Colbert asked. Investigators always asked about military. No indication whatsoever, Sterling lied smoothly. He had no indication either way, which meant he could choose his narrative. But the gaps suggest either identity theft or intentional documentation evasion. Either way, she's a liability. "I'll have a preliminary report by Friday," Colbert said. By 3:45 p.m., Sterling had drafted the memo to the board. Subject line, staffing security concern, background verification issue. He was careful with language. Not, "I think she's suspicious." More like, "Given our responsibility to families and fiduciary obligations, I recommend verification protocols before she accesses additional patient files." Institutional language. The kind that made investigations sound like bureaucracy instead of a tax. The HR meeting was scheduled for 4:15 p.m. in Conference Room B, which had no windows and acoustic panels that swallowed sound. Sterling had learned long ago that the physical space mattered. Closed doors. Overhead lighting that washed out color. 3 administrators across a table like a firing squad at rest. Elena arrived with her badge clipped to her scrubs, her hair still damp from the surgical sink where she'd spent her lunch washing blood out of the fibers. She sat without being invited to sit. Margaret Chen from HR opened a manila folder. "We need clarification on your employment history." specifically the period before your Tennessee clinic employment. Elena's hands rested on the table, steady as surgical instruments. What's the question? Where did you work before 2008? Sterling asked, his voice mild as a benediction. Various positions. Medical work, mostly. But no documented employment, Chen said, checking her notes. No W-2s, no tax records, no references we can verify. Your social security number doesn't appear in any database before 2008. Elena had prepared for this. Had spent 2 decades preparing for this specific conversation. Identity theft. 2007, I was rebuilding when I got the new number. Identity theft you haven't reported. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a man watching something very slowly sinking. Because that would generate documentation. Police reports. Fraud claims. I handled it privately, Elena said. You attended nursing school before the identity theft, Chen continued, following the script Sterling had written, but we can't locate any transcripts. The university you listed. Burned in a fire, Elena said. 2007, most records were destroyed. They have limited backup files. Sterling watched her, waiting for the tremor, the hesitation, the small tell that would indicate panic. He didn't see it. He saw something worse, a woman whose hands didn't shake because she'd learned long ago that fear was just data, processed and filed and set aside. He saw someone who'd thought about this conversation before. Multiple times. We've contacted the investigator who handled the fire recovery, Sterling said. They have no record of records reconstruction requests from your name or social security number. Which suggests you never requested them, which suggests either you're lying or you have something preventing you from accessing those records officially. Elena looked at him directly. The first real eye contact since she sat down. I didn't request them. I moved on. You moved on without verifying your educational credentials? Chen asked, pen poised. I passed the licensing exam. After somehow becoming a nurse without documented education, Sterling said, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, like he was tired of the performance now, tired of pretending this was anything other than a hunt. Elena, we have a responsibility to this hospital. To our patients. You understand that? I do. Then you understand why we need you to produce documentation of your prior employment, your education, and a valid explanation for the gaps in your social security history. Elena picked up the pen from the table. Didn't click it, didn't spin it. Just held it. The gesture contained everything, the choice to hold something instead of breaking it, to remain present instead of running. I don't have documentation to produce. The silence lasted for 0.3 seconds. Sterling had timed these moments before. For seconds is when people start filling the quiet with admissions. Elena filled it differently. But I can verify my nursing license and my clinical competency. Both are current. Both are legitimate. Sterling smiled then, and it was the smile of a man who'd already won, who was just enjoying the victory's shape. As of this moment, your access to patient files outside the Alzheimer's wing is restricted pending hours investigation. You'll be reassigned to daytime shifts in Wing C. I'll be reviewing your documentation requests before they're processed. He turned to Chen. Draft a formal notice. Make it clear the reassignment is temporary pending background verification, but make it clear that any further requests for patient information beyond her assigned wing will be grounds for immediate termination. Sterling stood. The meeting was over. But he wasn't finished, not even close. By 5:53 p.m., Elena was in Colonel Reeves' room, ostensibly completing her end-of-shift vitals, though she'd already completed them at 4:56 p.m. She was looking at him. Really looking. His eyes were moving beneath the lids in small, rapid oscillations. REM sleep. Dreaming. A man in a coma didn't dream. A man in a coma showed no sleep architecture, no sleep cycles, no response patterns. The door opened without a knock. Sterling stood there in the frame like he'd timed it perfectly, which he had. He always timed things perfectly. "I'm reassigning this patient," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "You'll focus on the Alzheimer's wing. Effective immediately." Elena didn't move. His response patterns are changing. Yesterday he... A wishful thinking, Sterling cut her off, moving to the chart with the efficiency of a man closing a file. "I've managed coma patients for 15 years. Vegetative state is vegetative state. My protocols keep him stable and billable. Your amateur observations help no one." He flipped through the chart without reading it, just establishing dominance through the gesture. "You want to know what I think, Elena? I think you came here with ideas about saving people. About being a hero. I think you saw a comatose veteran and thought you'd be the one to wake him up, get some redemption story, move on to the next hospital feeling good about yourself." He closed the chart with a sound like a door slamming. "That's not how this works. This is a business. These patients are resource management. You're a line item. When you stop being useful, you get reallocated. Or terminated." He left. The fluorescent lights buzzed in his absence, a sound Elena had learned to tune out but which now seemed very loud, very present, marking each second of the new situation forming around her like walls. She looked back at Reeves. His eyes had stopped moving. His breathing remained unchanged, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm with the steadiness of a second heartbeat. Elena made her decision in the space between two breaths. If Sterling wanted to bury her, she'd gather evidence first. She'd come in during breaks. During shift changes. During the hours when the surveillance cameras were less watched and her presence could be explained as dedicated care. She'd document what she saw. REM sleep. Movement. Response to stimuli. The 1,000 small indicators that the man everyone called vegetative was still in there, still fighting, still dreaming of things that might be either memory or hope. She reached out and squeezed his hand once. His fingers didn't squeeze back. They wouldn't. Not yet. But that wasn't the point. She had 40 hours a week as a nurse in the Alzheimer's wing, which meant Sterling had given her something he didn't know he'd given her, access to off-the-clock time. Time to move invisible through Sacred Heart's corridors. Time to prove that the man he wanted dead by protocol was still breathing, still fighting, still waiting for someone who recognized him. Elena clipped her badge back to her scrubs and walked toward the nursing station, where the night shift was already logging in for their rounds. Nobody looked at her. Nobody asked why she'd lingered in a patient's room past her shift. Nobody knew that the quiet woman with the steady hands had just declared war on a man who'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of institutional control. The night was just beginning. 3 nights after the investigator's call, Elena is working the Alzheimer's wing when the alarms start. Not the soft reminder chimes, the full code blue whale that splits the hospital into before and after. She's charting vitals on Mrs. Chen, 73 years old, asking her the same question she'll forget the answers to in 90 seconds, when the overhead system crackles, code blue, bed 7. Code blue, long-term care. All available personnel, bed 7. Bed 7. Her feet move before her mind catches up. The hallway is 30 yards. She covers it in 8 seconds. The Alzheimer's wing empties behind her, 2 CNAs, a respiratory tech, a nursing supervisor who won't make eye contact with Elena anymore. They're all moving toward the sound like iron filings to a magnet. The fluorescent lights blur overhead. Her badge swipes to unlock the secure doors. Red warning light pulsing. The alarm sounds like a mechanical heartbeat that's learned to scream. She reaches long-term care and the scene registers in layers. Colonel Reeves sits upright in bed, fighting for air like a drowning man in dry land. His skin is the color of storm clouds. His oxygen saturation reads 48% on the monitor, incompatible with consciousness, incompatible with living for more than minutes. His neck veins are distended like hydraulic hoses under pressure. His trachea is visibly shifted right, pushed out of the midline by something expanding in his chest that shouldn't be expanding. The ribs on his right side are hyperinflated, standing out like they're trying to escape. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung compressing the other organs, trapping pressure with every breath, asphyxiating him from the inside. The on-call resident, Dr. Patterson, stands 3 feet from the bed with his hands hovering over the crash cart. His mouth is open. His fingers are shaking so badly he can't grip the defibrillator pads. He's been a doctor for 6 months. He's never seen this outside a simulation. The nursing supervisor is calling for a chest tube kit, a surgeon, anyone who knows how to cut into a human body and let the pressure escape. The respiratory tech is bagging Reeves manually, forcing air into lungs that can't accept it, making everything worse with each squeeze of the bag. Nobody is moving. Nobody is doing. Elena is already moving. She grabs a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, angiocath, the kind they use for emergency access when time is the only thing you have less of an options. The metal feels cold. The length of her finger. She doesn't think about protocol. She doesn't think about scope of practice or board restrictions or the fact that Sterling's investigator is somewhere in this hospital right now, collecting evidence like a vulture collecting feathers. She thinks about a kid in Baghdad with shrapnel in his chest, gasping like Reeves is gasping, and she thinks about the sound his mother made when he took the first easy breath after Elena fixed what was broken. 2% betadine. Now. Her voice is concrete. The supervisor hands her an alcohol swab before the betadine. Elena takes it without comment. She places Reeves' right hand across his chest, exposes the ribs underneath, counts down from the clavicle. First intercostal space. Second space. The midclavicular line. That's where the needle goes, not at random, not by hope, but by the mathematics of anatomy, the geometry of survival. The supervisor watches. Patterson watches. The respiratory tech watches. 16 other people have gathered in the doorway, nurses, med students, a chaplain who really should not be here but nobody tells him to leave. They watch Elena position the needle perpendicular to the ribs, watch her place her other hand flat on his chest for stability, watch her take one breath. The needle goes in between the ribs. The angle is perfect. The depth is perfect. She's done this before, but not with walls of eyes and institutional fear pressing down on her shoulders. She's done this in dust and screaming and the kind of darkness that makes you believe the world has forgotten color. The muscle memory doesn't care where it lives. Her hands move on their own. The hiss of air escaping is louder than the alarm. It's the sound of pressure releasing, of something lethal changing its mind. The needle punctures the parietal pleura and the pleural space lets go of everything it's been holding. The rush of air is almost violent. The heart monitor changes. The oxygen saturation rises. 48 becomes 52 becomes 68 becomes 84 in 17 seconds. Reeves' breathing changes, from that desperate, drowning gasping to something that resembles air instead of warfare. His skin color shifts from storm cloud gray to something closer to human. His eyes flutter, unfocused, confused, but the pupils are reactive and the breathing is regular. 90 seconds. From code to stabilization. Elena secures the needle with tape and a transparent dressing, applies a 3-sided seal to prevent the air from coming back in, protocol, the kind she should not be performing but just performed anyway with the efficiency of someone who learned medicine in a field hospital instead of a classroom. The respiratory tech removes the bag. Reeves breathes on his own. The monitor becomes a rhythm instead of a scream. The alarm stops. The silence is worse. Patterson is still standing there, hands at his sides, staring at Elena with an expression like someone watching a stranger remove their face. The supervisor is on the radio calling off the crash team, her voice steady but her eyes aren't steady, her eyes are looking at Elena like Elena has just broken something fundamental about how the world is supposed to work. 16 people in the doorway are looking at the same woman they saw make beds yesterday, take temperatures, smile politely when they spoke down to her. The mask has slipped. The competence is showing. The quiet nurse has just performed a procedure that requires authorization and training and years of medical credentialing. His oxygen saturation is stabilizing. Elena's voice is flat. He needs a chest X-ray to confirm the lung has re-expanded. The needle is temporary, he'll need a chest tube if there's significant fluid reaccumulation. Respiratory should continue monitoring. She's speaking to Patterson but not looking at him, looking instead at the monitor, at Reeves, at the numbers that matter more than words. If his saturation drops again, page me. I'll be on the Alzheimer's wing. She does not wait for permission. She walks out of bed 7 the same way she walked in, her movements efficient, her hands steady, her breathing level, and the hallway feels smaller than it did 3 minutes ago because everyone in it is stepping back to let her pass. By 6:22 a.m., the security footage is being reviewed in Sterling's office. A tech sits with him, both of them watching the feed from camera 7 north, Elena's hands, the needle, the perfect angle, the sound nobody can hear but everyone watches. The needle goes in. Air rushes out. Reeves lives. Sterling's hands are very still on his desk. How is this possible? He doesn't sound angry. He sounds confused, the way a man sounds when the world has failed to obey the rules he wrote. She performed an emergency needle decompression. The tech is 19 years old and doesn't understand yet that he's watching a man lose power. Full procedure. Textbook execution. She doesn't have the credentials. No, sir. She violated protocol. She exceeded her scope. She performed a procedure that requires physician authorization. Yes, sir. And she saved his life. The tech doesn't answer because the answer is obvious and Sterling doesn't want obvious right now. Sterling wants explanations that fit inside his framework, actions that make sense within the hierarchy he's built. He wants Elena to be what he decided she was, a compliant placeholder, a pair of hands without judgment, a woman who would take his insults and say nothing and disappear at the end of her shift. He's been wrong about the woman in bed 7's chart. He's been catastrophically wrong. By 7:15 a.m. he's calling board members. By 8:51 a.m. he's compiled a written complaint, unauthorized medical procedure, patient endangerment, violation of hospital protocol, reckless behavior outside certified scope of practice, potential harm despite superficially positive outcome. By 9:48 a.m. he's requested an emergency investigation. The fact that she saved a patient's life is not a mitigating factor. The fact that she saved a patient's life is the problem. It proves she's a threat to institutional control, to the order that keeps lesser people in their place. By noon, Elena's badge has been deactivated. She's in the employee break room when security walks in. Not walks, they arrive like a foreclosure. 2 officers in Navy uniforms, neither of them meeting her eyes, both of them carrying the specific shame of people being asked to do Sterling's bidding. Ms. Martinez. You need to come with us. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. You're to be escorted from the building. Elena doesn't argue. She packs her cardboard box, coffee mug with Sacred Heart's logo, a single framed photo from before the Navy erased her file, 2 pens that don't belong to the hospital, and follows them toward the exit. The other nurses are at stations and desks, studiously focused on computers, on charting, on anything except the woman being walked out of the building by security for the crime of saving someone's life. Sterling waits in the long-term care doorway, arms crossed, watching her perp walk like a director watching his favorite scene. His face is satisfied. His posture is victorious. Whatever you're hiding, he says as she passes, it's going to bury you before you can cause more damage here. Elena stops. The security officers stop. The cardboard box is heavy in her hands, not from weight but from everything that's not in it. All the years. All the identities. All the things the Navy told her to forget. She turns to face Sterling, and for a moment her eyes are not the eyes of a compliant nurse. They're the eyes of a senior chief who's already seen the worst and walked through it. They're the eyes of someone who pulled 6-year-old boys from collapsed markets and kept them breathing and stood in the doorway when their mothers came to reclaim them. I've picked up better men than you from worse places than this. Her voice doesn't rise. It doesn't need to. And I did it for free. She leaves. The parking lot is empty, no witnesses, no vindication, just Elena standing with a cardboard box and the realization that the one place she was supposed to be invisible has burned her out. She sits in her car for 20 minutes with the engine off and the windows closed and her hands on the steering wheel. The hospital towers above her like a monument to all the things she can't have: stability, recognition, a job that doesn't disappear the moment she proves she's capable of doing it. By 2:13 p.m. she's sitting in the waiting room of the Raleigh VA Medical Center. The walls are the color of old bandages. The chairs are plastic. Around her sit men and women with missing limbs, with PTSD tremors, with the 1,000-yard stare that never quite focuses on anything in this century. A woman missing her left leg sits 3 chairs down, reading a pamphlet about prosthetic retraining. A man with a service dog, a German Shepherd, alert, trained to watch for panic attacks, sits across from her. A kid, can't be more than 22, wears a burn mask and stares at nothing. Elena has treated all of these people. Not their specific wounds, but their specific suffering. She's bandaged that kind of pain. She's held the hand of that kind of loss. She fills out intake paperwork for psychiatric services. Name, well, not her real name, but the name that belongs to this life now. Social Security number, the one the Navy gave her, the one that erases everything before 2008. Reason for visit: I need someone to tell me if I'm crazy for thinking I can disappear without hurting the people I'm supposed to protect. That's not what she writes. She writes, occupational stress. History of trauma. Need evaluation. A hospital, firing her. A patient, needing her. The irony is so complete it circles back to becoming poetic, the kind of poetry that people who work in institutions write in hospital rooms at 3 in the morning when nobody else is awake. She's sitting in a waiting room surrounded by the people she used to save, and now she's one of them. This is the lowest point. This is the moment before the world breaks open. By morning, the call started. Dr. Sterling sat in his office with the door closed, phone pressed to his ear, his voice smooth as warmed brandy. Board member Hayes? Sterling here. Yes, about last night's incident in bed 7. I need to flag some serious concerns about our newest hire's decision-making process. He paused, listening. Needle decompression without radiographic confirmation. She could have collapsed a healthy lung. It's cowboy medicine, frankly. I'm worried about liability. Another pause. The phone receiver crackled with a voice Elena couldn't hear, but Sterling's smile was visible through the thin office window. Exactly. Reckless. I'm compiling documentation now. By 10 in the morning, Sterling had made 3 calls. One to board member Hayes. One to board member Rutherford, the orthopedic surgeon who still golfed with Sterling on Saturdays. One to board member Chen, who owed Sterling a favor for hiring his nephew. Each call lasted between 90 seconds and 3 minutes. Each call ended the same way, Sterling nodding as if the voice on the other end could see him, then hanging up with the expression of a man who had just secured something valuable. At 11:30, Sterling made a call to Tennessee. Dr. Reinhard at Mercy General? This is Dr. Sterling at Sacred Heart in Raleigh. I'm calling about a reference. Elena Martinez worked in your long-term care facility? Yes. I need to verify her credentials and background. Employment dates, licensure, any incidents. He listened. His expression didn't change, but his knuckles whitened on the phone. Her employment records appear spotty? Can you clarify that? Another long silence. I see. You don't have anything after 2008? Nothing before 2002? Sterling's jaw tightened. No, that's helpful. Very helpful. We may need to discuss this further with our HR department. He hung up. He didn't call back to explain. Instead, Sterling called his assistant. Get me an outside investigator. Someone discreet. I want background on Elena Martinez, verified, employment, references, credentialing, everything. And I want it by end of day. The assistant asked a question. Sterling's voice dropped. Because I suspect credential fraud, that's why. Move. By noon, Sterling had activated his full institutional apparatus. The investigator was already making calls to Tennessee, to hospitals where Elena had supposedly worked, to nursing boards in 3 states. The requests went into a file labeled Credential Verification, Urgent. By 1 o'clock, Sterling had the preliminary report. Employment records that didn't connect. Reference checks that came back incomplete. A service record that vanished in 2008 and resumed in 2010 under circumstances that defied explanation. A woman who existed in fragments, in shadows, with gaps that looked like someone had taken an eraser to official records. Sterling smiled. That was enough. It was enough to ask questions. Enough to suggest fraud. Enough to create doubt. At 1:45 p.m., Sterling called the compliance officer. I need Elena Martinez's access badge deactivated. Immediately. Credential fraud investigation. Yes, now. He hung up before the compliance officer could ask for details. Elena didn't know any of this. She was working bed for when her badge suddenly wouldn't open the medication dispensary. She was changing linens in bed 6 when security appeared in the corridor, 2 officers with the careful, neutral expressions of people about to perform an uncomfortable task. Elena Martinez, the older officer said. You need to come with us. She followed without resistance. That was the composure. That was the training. You don't resist. You don't demand explanations. You move with the kind of calm that comes from understanding that panic doesn't change outcomes, only clarity does. The officers escorted her to the break room, where Sterling was waiting with human resources, his arms crossed, his expression carefully arranged into something that resembled regret. Elena, he said, as if they were old friends about to part ways, we've had some concerning questions come up regarding your employment history. HR has decided to place you on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation into your credentials. Elena didn't ask what questions. She didn't ask about the emergency procedure that saved Colonel Reeves' life. She didn't ask about the investigator or the phone calls or the deliberate architecture of doubt that Sterling had constructed. She simply nodded, removed her badge, and held out her hand. Sterling took it from her fingers as if accepting a surrender. Your final check will be mailed, he said. Security will escort you to your locker. They walked her through the hospital like she was a prisoner being removed from a crime scene. Past the nursing station where she'd worked that morning. Past bed 7, where Colonel Reeves was resting, where he couldn't see her leaving. Past the cafeteria where Sterling had knocked her tray to the floor and she had responded with the kind of dignity that now meant nothing. The nurses pretended not to watch. The ones who might have defended her were carefully busy with charts, with monitors, with any task that required them to look away. The parking lot was grey and empty. August heat wavered off the asphalt in liquid sheets. Elena walked to her car, sat in the front seat with the door open, and breathed the kind of breath that comes after a body stops running from danger, the exhale when you realize the danger has caught you anyway. That evening, she sat in a waiting room. Not Sacred Heart's cafeteria. Not her apartment. A different building entirely, on the eastern edge of Raleigh where the VA Medical Center sprawled across 30 acres like a monument to all the people the country had broken and then tried to fix. The Raleigh VA. The place that treated the wounds that hospitals like Sacred Heart preferred not to acknowledge. The waiting room was full of men in various states of reconstruction. A veteran missing his left arm sat across from a veteran whose left eye was covered with a flesh-colored patch. Another veteran wore a prosthetic leg under loose hospital scrubs and scrolled through his phone with the hyper-focused intensity of someone trying not to think. Another sat very still, not making eye contact with anyone, not moving unless he had to, the kind of stillness that Elena recognized from her own mirror. The stillness of people who had learned to disappear inside themselves. She was waiting for a psychiatric intake appointment. Mandatory, the note had said. Recommended after employment termination due to credible concerns about judgment and safety. The words had arrived in an email 12 hours before she'd been escorted out of Sacred Heart, attached to a document she hadn't known existed. Someone had prepared it ahead of time. Someone had assumed this ending and decided to arrange it, brick by brick. The waiting room smelled like floor wax and coffee gone cold in a pot since morning. A nurse called a name. Not hers. Another veteran stood, moved toward the door, disappeared into the system. The afternoon light through the window was starting to yellow at the edges. The shadows under the fluorescent lights were getting longer. Elena's hand rested on the jacket in her lap, an old thing, canvas and thread, the kind of jacket you took through 3 deployments and never threw away. Inside the lining, sewn tight and hidden, was a patch. Unit insignia. Faded from sweat and desert sun and 20 years of being something she couldn't acknowledge. The patch was the only piece of proof that she had ever been anyone other than Elena Martinez, nurse, employee, the woman they'd fired for being competent. She touched it now, just once, just enough to feel the embroidery beneath the canvas. The texture of her own history, stitched into a prison where no one could ever find it. If 20 years of erasure, 20 years of assuming another name, sleeping under another identity, training for emergencies she never expected to see again, if all of that had led to this, to sitting in a VA waiting room being evaluated for psychiatric fitness after trying to save a man's life, then what had any of it been for? The extraction had been classified. Her records had been sealed. The mission that wasn't supposed to exist had been conducted by people who no longer officially existed, and she had spent 2 decades honoring that silence. She had protected the secret. She had asked nothing in return. She had just wanted to heal people and be left alone. The clock on the wall read for 22 p.m. Another name was called. Another veteran stood and moved toward the door. The waiting room was slowly emptying, filling with evening quiet. Elena sat very still and did not cry. The trembling was in her hands, but she pressed them into her lap where no one could see. She didn't know that in Arlington, Virginia, in a classified operations center, a Navy SEAL commander had just received a call about a terminated nurse at Sacred Heart Medical Center. She didn't know that a file was being opened. She didn't know that her own medical miracle, the fact that Colonel Reeves was beginning to show signs of neurological improvement, was beginning to respond to stimuli, was beginning to come back from the place where he'd been lost, had triggered protocols. She didn't know that someone had noticed the correlation. That someone had started connecting threads. She was just sitting in a waiting room, holding a jacket that contained proof of a life she'd been ordered to forget, wondering if the truth would ever be allowed to surface, or if she would spend the next 20 years exactly as she had spent the last one, erased, invisible, waiting for a permission that would never come. And then, somewhere in the dark that was starting to fall outside the VA windows, the phone rang. If you survived this story as a viewer, you're probably thinking Sterling deserved worse. The truth is, justice in real institutions rarely looks like movies. It's slower, quieter, and sometimes it comes from directions no one expected. Subscribe for the next segment, because the call Elena doesn't yet know is coming will change everything. Like this video if you believe in recognizing people before they break. Comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real story?